Thank you very much indeed for your presentations and to Professor Kung in his absence.
Yes.
My name's Tim McQuillan. I'm the director of the Methodist Ecumenical Office in Rome. I have a particular way of looking at the world. I'm a church historian, but you thought that the three papers were not connected at all. But I could see that there was a sort of common theme running through it. And that was the sense of, as you raised, Ambassador Kamara, reformation, and the sense of those who are on the peripheries of life, social, political, economic, reacting against those who want to pull everything into the centre. Now, I'm a Methodist, and the Methodist movement in the 18th century in Britain was formed to reform the church. That's what John Wesley did. He didn't come to abolish the church or to upset it, but of course the church wasn't for reformation. As you said, it's a continual battle. And so they, instead of being conformists as they wanted to be, they became non-conformists. That is, because of the state religion in Britain of the Church of England, Methodists were outside that and were not able to reform from within. In terms of the Reformation in the 16th century, clearly Luther's reform of the church didn't happen, in the sense that the church was not for Reformation in terms of the Catholic Church of that day, and he set in motion something which unleashed nationality. In a conference we were at, one of the speakers talked about ethnicity trumping religion. The religious impulse is always subject to the national interest of particular nation peoples and other things which pull from the central of trying to get a religion which actually reflects the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church to which we all aspire, ut unum sint, that they all may be one, as Jesus said to the disciples. And as an ecumenical person, that bothers me. And in a sense, Hans Kung in his paper pulls us back to that, that we get on fine with Orthodox Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, we have our dialogues, we talk about this and that, we've come to a joint statement on justification, but, and it's the but, as he reminded us, but in terms of nature of church, nature of authority, we have no common agreement yet. Yes, a common baptism, except that sometimes we have different ways of understanding that, but not common Eucharistic hospitality. So there are big issues still to be addressed which are on a faith basis, doctrinal basis, but the essential thing is that we do work together, and we do dialogue, and we do work together in terms of what another speaker recently called an ecumenism of action. That's Christians actually demonstrating that they can work together so that the world may believe. So I think there's a very great tension in terms of the nationalities of the 16th century, French and Spanish. The empires are at war, and the papacy gets trapped in the middle of all that. They are puppets of the political systems of their day.
Or the puppeteer.
Or the puppeteer, pulling the strings, yes. And then in terms of Georgia and the relationship with Russia, I can see that, again, tension between centre, perceived centre, not central if you're sitting in Constantinople, and other things. Thank you.
Thank you.
I welcome comments on that. It may be complete rubbish.
Yeah, I want to comment on Hans Kung's actual paper, that he's an ecumenist, and he was I mean, he's a great theologian, one of the great theologians in my view of the 20th century. What the model he proposes, reconcile diversity. You know, you said reconcile something else. But this is a well-known model in the ecumenical movement. So he was probably part of the ecumenical endeavor, the time when this visible unity was seen, or was supposed to mean reconcile diversity. Unfortunately, in ecumenical journey, you know, I I don't know, unfortunately it's probably out of context here. In ecumenical journey, this vision of visible unity differs, changes. At the moment it's a little critical, as we heard in Bose. Remember that the Lutherans think, but I don't agree fully with that. But so this reconciled diversity is one of the important contributions to the modern thought, I would say, of the ecumenical journey. You first.
Certainly, just in terms of the 16th century, there was no attempt by Clement VII at any sort of ecumenical dialogue at all. Quite the opposite. Right. It was subterfuge and double dealing all the way through. And as we mentioned before, the mere fact that he was held up in Castle St. Angelo at this very moment meant that by default, almost, the English Reformation took place, because Henry VIII could not get to his ally through the Treaty of Cognac and get the divorce that he required. So, force of circumstances brought about, in this particular case, not an ecumenical dialogue, but an actual rift in the church.
Can you follow up on that? Just for both, actually, Paula and Paul, and going back to observations, comments related to Colloquium, how much do you see the church structures, both in the 16th century and nowadays, as being this factor that actually goes in the opposite direction from the ecumenical dialogue? And now I specifically asked Tamara also from her experience, not just as a scholar and professor, but also from her ecumenical experience and also current experience as the ambassador to the Holy See. Because what very often we see, like in the case of Colloquium, that those figures that act more or less independently, we can hear from them very open statements about ecumenism, the need for a dialogue, and so on. But then the question is how, and that's one of the points of Colloquium, as okay, but church structures need to now implement, need to do something. And church structures tend to be very rigid and tend to resist. So how much do you see there the problem of ecumenical dialogue as being primarily an issue that has to do with internal power dynamics within each of these churches? How much is it more of a practical issue rather than a theological or theoretical issue? Because it seems to me that theology can go various ways, but once you need to implement something, you deal with so many practicalities, and so many people who want to keep their position, and then internal power struggles that actually don't necessarily contribute to this dialogue. Or do you both see some ways in which dialogue could be or could have been strengthened at a particular period of time by looking more directly into the mechanism of practicalities of church life in terms of its just power structures?
Shall I answer?
Yes, I could first.
Yeah, well, I think the way the question was posed involved answers, so I can only continue on this reflection, which is true that yes, from what we know from documents or ecumenical bilateral or multilateral conversations and documents, or from my experience when I've been into these meetings, like Tim also can confirm, there is always this desire to, I mean, because people who come to these dialogues, they want to talk. I mean, if you invite those who don't want to talk, then this will not happen. So at least this is good, that they come with the intention to talk, and not to only defend their position, but also to understand the other. So this is crucial. Yeah. And I mean, ecumenical dialogues been quite successful in understanding, in promoting understanding of one another. And then people go back to their homes full of enthusiasm, and then almost nothing happens. So, why? As you said, there are so many impending sort of factors that you cannot list them all, because it varies also from structure to structure. Certainly internal structure, internal power games always is the biggest factor. And then for me, in a way, the most important thing is civil society. You know, it's a sociological problem, what is happening in the church. Looking at the dynamics in the Orthodox churches, for instance, yes, I always speak from their perspective because this is my milieu. Yeah. Now, if society were better educated in terms of what its role and task, and better knowledge of what the church is about, then they would have the church, which is also people. You cannot say church without people, even with the strongest hierarchical systems. I mean, people are still important, even with our structures. Yeah, then there would this non-reception of this exquisite or luxurious, let's say, dialogues would be less effective, because in a way there is a luxury to bring people together who are intellectually more or less in the same level, and they can talk. I mean, this is really, first of all, it's very costly, and secondly, it's a big advantage, you know, to be part of it, honestly, when you don't have to punch each other, but, you know, you just want to listen and understand. So, but then it cannot be translated into practical matters of the church. Like all churches, even newer churches, have very rigid structures to receive new things. You know, once your identity is marked as a church, which is a good example, Methodist Church, which never wanted to be a new church, but it had to, because it had to mark its identity at the end of the day, yeah, then it is more difficult to receive these new things. So if people were more creative, and didn't you speak about creative freedom or something, or Christians? Yes, we should continue. Then perhaps, but you know, it's also asking too much of people. But now, what can be done even with these complexities? You know, because the church, of the role of the church is not very clear in the society nowadays. I mean, yeah, church should be, especially the Orthodox Church, okay, more active agent of the society. It is not an active agent. It's an agent for itself, because it feels also, it has excuses for it. It's been threatened, it's been marginalized, you know. But if we were much freer to speak for ourselves as full members of the society, then things would be advancing probably easier. But even within this framework, what can be done? To talk more ecumenically about creating spiritual practices, establishing spiritual practices. Because this is one word that everybody, sectarians, whatever we call, how we identify them, new churches, evangelicals, Orthodox, Catholics, all want to hear how, or know how to give to the flock this nourishment, spiritual practices. And it is not under spiritual practices, I don't mean only worship in the church, but as Orthodox I must say that any spiritual activity is a continuation of the liturgy, Eucharistic liturgy. This is how we understand ourselves, liturgy after liturgy. But liturgia, its Greek word, means work. So these spiritual practices, this should be at the heart of ecumenical discussions, and certainly grassroots movements can do more locally if they reach global level somehow also. So spiritual point, how to, it's not only, doctrine, talking about, I mean spirituality is also part of the doctrine, but talking about dogmatic differences only, divergences, and I mean because professionally I've studied documents, these bilaterals, and it's, they agree on everything, and then something detailed, which is not really theologically important, and they say, but we don't disagree, and they cannot go further. So the churches themselves don't want really to go further.
Maybe just before Paul follow up on that, do you think, because from your presentation it kind of implied that a more active role of laity, lay people would be desired, and do you see
women.
And women also. That in the Orthodox and Catholic Church implies lay people by definition. So do you see that also as a factor that would contribute to just challenging those power structures within the Church and pushing the Church through a more active role of lay people toward ecumenical dialogue? Because my only reservation there is that looking at concrete examples of Orthodox churches, even for example, take Orthodox churches as an example, that in some cases actually you have parts of the church hierarchy being more open to one dialogue and changes, but actually you have among the lay people and lower clergy much more conservative or right-wing, so that actually allowing more space for the lay people not necessarily imply moving into a
But you missed out one important thing, which I also mentioned, education. Without education, you cannot work with people. I look at democracy now. Democracy works at the moment, I mean, because people don't know what to do when they go to vote. So, and how to make the decisions. This is, it's even more so with the church. Now we have no church teaching anywhere, at school, nowhere, see? Or families before, probably 100 years ago, even 100 years ago, families would sit down and read Bible and say prayers together regularly. I mean, this is now an exceptional thing, right? Largely societies don't live like this. So first of all, education, that's why I'm saying it's a social, sociological thing. Societies are not educated enough, and then they don't know how to apply this spirituality and lack of education. And listen, we have such a big challenge, and also I would not use these words like challenging and pushing. This is not the right word on the part of the Laos to Theo, which is, the people of God should not push or that's already bad. They should work together, co-workers. I see them both church structures and people like co-workers. But I'm speaking idealistically because we are Christians. So we should not hide this.
Just to go back to the rigidity of church structures. If one thinks of the great councils from the 15th and 16th century, the Council of Constance, the Council of Ferrara, and the Council of Trent, they are, none of them, great successes. The Council of Constance is a success in that we get rid of 3 popes and have 1, but we have, as far as dialogue is concerned, the burden of Jan Hus as part of the major events that take place there. The Council of Ferrara doesn't work ultimately as an ecumenical council. It's all about a Catholic Church asserting its hierarchy over the Orthodox churches, the Copts, etc. The Council of Trent is an innate failure because entirely of the power struggles within the church structure. Luther will not arrive into a form of dialogue through fear that he would too be arrested and burned. The example of Huss is given. The Council of Trent goes on for 26 years because of the infighting among the various factions of the Cardinals. And what I find is a particularly sort of interesting point of comparison. At exactly the same time the Council of Trent is being wrapped up, if we go to Mughal India, this is not Mongol, but Mughal India, we find the Sultan there, Akbar, the Mughal Emperor, actually holding weekly meetings at Fatehpur Sikri, his new capital. Weekly meetings with the Sufis, with the Hindus, with the Muslims, to try and come to some sort of accord over his vast-ranging empire, which covers these various denominations. And these meetings do have a success. They do have some sort of peacekeeping force. And it's only really when the Jesuits move in and try to usurp them that these meetings themselves fall to pieces. So there's something that seems to be, I'm stepping out of line here, innate in church structure in the 16th century, which takes Catholic church structure in the 16th century, which takes a long time, if indeed it ever has done, for it to dismantle and open itself to dialogue.
It took 300 years.
Well, because it's still if indeed, yes.
I have a question for you, Paul. As a scholar of the Jesuit history and narrative and worldview, we're talking about Reformation. How much of a mark of Jesuit identity and self-understanding is this anti-Reformation, or negative view of the Reformation, meaning the Protestant Reformation? How much part of the DNA of the Jesuit order is, because, and this is the background, and then because now we have a Jesuit Pope, which apparently is very smiling, affirming, ecumenically minded, and yet that Jesuit DNA is very much part of who he is.
Yes.
So there might be superficial analysis that overlook, the Jesuit history, or just tend to historicize the past without taking it into consideration. What would be your...
Well, there's two points I would make here. Certainly, the Jesuit antagonism to anything not Jesuit is true, but I think that only to a certain point, and that certain point is to the dissolution of the Jesuit order at the end of the 18th century. Up until that point, we do have that extraordinarily rigid, white is black, black is white, if the Pope says so, as part of the Jesuit mentality. But from the moment that the order is refounded, starts again, then there's a completely different mentality. But for those 200 years from the death of Ignatius in 1547 through to the dissolution at the end of the 18th century, then we do have a real militant arm of the church, the stormtroopers of Christ. And I think that really does inform everything that they do. I try to argue against it, but when I come to the documents, having dinner with some Jesuits this evening, so they will no doubt tell me otherwise. But every time you look at the documents, you see that there's no real attempt at dialogue. I mean, one of the things I always find interesting is that Henry VIII dates 1493 to 1547 are exactly the same dates as Ignatius of Loyola. They were born in the same year and they died in the same year. and they both lead to very opposing, but at the same time, different views on opposing, but also sort of connected views on the church. I can only give you examples of the Jesuit attitude to conversion. And I give you one specific example, following on the coattails of the Portuguese in Goa in India. There was an attempt, or briefly, to try and make the capture of Goa City into a sort of a peaceful, having wiped out the entire Muslim population. There was an attempt to pacify, in peaceful terms, the surrounding countryside. The Franciscans and then later the Dominicans were actually quite good at this. When the Jesuits arrived, after Xavier comes in, things change dramatically, and there's no attempt at dialogue. It is destruction. Destruction supported by the Portuguese arms. And we find Hindu shrines wiped out, temples destroyed, and churches built dramatically on the foundations of Hindu shrines. I have a story of a sacred cow, its intestines ripped out and thrown into the ritual bathing pools. That is Jesuit dialogue in the 16th century. I don't think you could take that and put it at the door of our present Pope. I think things have changed in the writing of the 18th century.
But also, isn't it 16th century, this, when the Jesuits went to Japan and they were so persecuted, so this is...
No, it's tit for tat. No, but that's the shogun coming in, and that's wiping out everybody. That's not just the Jesuits, everybody gets wiped out at that particular point. Anybody who's there who professes Christianity, apart from the merchants who keep themselves very quiet, are wiped out.
It's not just the Jesuits, though, it's other religious orders too. There's a sort of almost pattern, and it's not just exclusively Catholic, it's also Protestant.
Yes, exactly.
That the charisma of the founder is somehow lost, and what Weber would call the bureaucratization of charisma sets in, and it gets structural, and it gets hostile to any others, including those within their own churches. And then at some stage there's a rediscovery of the charisms of the founder, whether it's Luther, Calvin, or John Wesley, or whoever, and then there's a reformation of the religious movement in a rather more in the spirit of the founder, rather than the stormtroopers who followed, as it were.
But one finds out, even in the Middle Ages, St. Benedict's followers, the Benedictines, were not peace-loving guys all the time either. The early Franciscans were brawling in the streets with the Dominicans too, so it's a common phenomenon.
And students must ask even silly questions for us.
Do any of you see any future like great rifts within the sort of Christian, dialogue, just within the space of it?
The prophetic knowledge.
Yes, go on.
It's been quite a lot has been achieved. When people speak about the negative side of ecumenism or not achieving much, it's not. I feel like it's not fair, because 52 years ago, before the Vatican II, churches were not talking to one another. And before the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, Christians would not come together. So only in the beginning of the 20th century they started, so 100 years ago, a little bit more. And historical accusations and malice against each other are innumerable. So this is all behind. Now Jung's demand to vindicate fully Luther, I think he's been vindicated through this year, no? More or less. I mean, when Pope went to Rome, they had this celebration, and he came to the Lutheran Church in Rome. Now we have to work with the Orthodox to do this. So, yeah, but if people want, if you want and your friends want it, and probably it seems natural to you, I can imagine frustration of the young generation, you know, young people coming to this, what are they talking about, you know, what's the problem, really? But yeah, I think it is, if you ask me if this Pope wants and he finds an ally with the Orthodox, like Ecumenical Patriarch, for instance, they can proclaim one day intercommunion. It will cause a lot of disruption, but you know, they could. No, you think not?
I think the politics takes over.
Yeah, that's another.
The politics takes over far too quickly. International priorities, national priorities.
Which should not be the church's
No,
concern.
not at all. It's when the church decides to meddle that the fine happens, or not.
Do you want to comment on the answer?
I don't have anything specific, but I guess another question would be, do you think there's been greater efforts towards uniting Christianity with some scientific, I guess, findings, or a greater effort for sort of like interfaith dialogue with
I think it's a very good question. A scientific approach is something that always works. First of all, science is not, does not have this absolute ideal that religion has. So therefore, to meet on the scientific platform gives good ground for you know, conversation which makes sense. And I mean, in this era, I started this, you know, with the spiritual practices, especially with this huge challenge that humanity has today in terms of climate change and all the environmental, you know, issues that we have. I mean, this should be also very. But again, we run into politics as soon as we start discussing, because politics is in all discussions. You know, Arnold said that as soon as someone starts speaking loudly, it is political.
We have just the time to lunch and serve lunch. For one question, or actually two parts of the same question, Tamara, about more specifically 1917. So how much do you see back then in this whole atmosphere of the revolutionary times? That up to a certain point was very much an atmosphere of optimism and openness and change and democracy and all of that. How do you see back then this question of presence of the church in the Russian society at that particular moment? So do you see this attempt that the Council of 1917, for example, as something that's compatible to a much more general mindset or zeitgeist of the 1970, or do you see that as an attempt of the church to take the opportunity to do something in the new context, or as a reaction to the new context, or because the problem for me is always that 1970 and up to Lenin's death somehow collapses together with what comes after, and one needs to differentiate these early years where really a lot of things were going on. So do you see there, hypothetically speaking, a chance without what happened later, a chance that something else could have happened in the immediate post-revolutionary times when it comes to the place and role of the church within the Russian society.
Unfortunately, history doesn't know this could have happened.
Yes,
so
but we can do
that.
Well, what you can say is, and sorry to drag you back into the 16th century, immediately after Luther nailed his thesis and there was the Protestant Revolution, if we want to call it that, there was throughout Germany this peasants' uprising, which has been many times cited as prototype to the revolutions of later Europe, be it France or indeed Russia. And in fact, it was rather interesting how Luther immediately, when he sees this uprising, that it actually causes this wave of exuberance which results in destruction, how he separates himself from that. And in fact, it comes to the secular authorities to actually repress it, and he's very much on their side. So it's almost a parallel situation to what you had in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and we never learn from history.
No, of course.
Well, with Russia, this church council, you know, I'm not a specialist of the church council, although I worked on it, especially with regard to the Georgian church, but to my knowledge, I think it had very many progressive ideas and proposals. And this was, in Russia was a vast empire, so although it was run by some obscure statesmen who wanted to rule it in their own way, but also it had this fresh minds and some kind of fresh ideas, yes, which led to the idea of reformation, which at the end turned out to be disastrous. So with the church, I believe that there was this intention to bring real reform to the church, especially that it was in very bad shape. Imagine the church was run by police, secret police, and the trace of which you can see probably in modern times also. But you know, this was disastrous for centuries for the church. It also the trust between the church and the society. And the church was very, I read some, you know, it's again not my specialty, but I read about the church in the 19th century Russia where aristocracy would not go so much to the church. They were using church for rituals and something, but they were sort of beyond it. They didn't associate very closely with that. Even though theologically it was so advanced that it gave some great names in the beginning of the 20th century. So there was this intention, but again, I mean, really, there is no answer, there are no works answering this question. Why this good, you know, good intentions or this positive, progressive move in society and church ended in such disaster? Yes, okay, there are some ideas that German funded the Bolsheviks and some kind of things, but you know, who wanted this? What happened to Russia? Eventually, it was a disaster.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, for your participation and contribution. So I think now it's lunchtime, if I'm not mistaken. So.